Welcome back to Communicology. I would bet that nearly everybody listening likes movies. But have you ever heard them called the motion pictures industry before? And have you ever wondered why they're called motion pictures? You know, that's sometimes an older term, but it still gets thrown around quite a good bit today. So you think of the idea of motion pictures or movies, or are they the same thing? What about like cinema and film? Or, you know, when people talk about that, or video, what's the difference between some of these terms that we have? Well, today I want to talk about the idea of motion pictures and basically how movies even got started. It's kind of a little bit of a fun time nerd topic that would probably be good for you if you ever get on Jeopardy. But it's one of those things that it's just neat, and it's just kind of fascinating because we spend so much time watching movies, and of course the world of video wouldn't exist without this concept. So I want to dig into that just to have a little bit of trip down history lane here and talk about those kind of things. Now, the idea of motion pictures comes about because literally, when you look at video, there's no such thing as video. Which sounds a little bit weird because you're thinking, wait a minute, are you not doing a video right now? I watched a video from TikTok, or I saw a movie and that was a video. What do you mean it doesn't exist? Meaning there is no such thing as actual video. It's all moving pictures, motion pictures. And the reason why it works is if you've ever come across an old piece of film, you pull the film out and you can see all these individual pictures. Well, what happens is those pictures are moved in front of a light source and they're moved at a certain rate of speed, and voila, you have motion pictures. So there's no such thing as actually capturing the actual motion. You're capturing a bunch of pictures. Where did this start? Well, there's this gentleman his last name was Muybridge, and he was tasked with coming up with the idea of how do horses run? Because when you look at early paintings, say like in the 1800s of horses running, they're always with their front and rear legs splayed way out. Like when you watch like wiener dogs run, that's how they run. Or cheetahs, they run with their feet, way out at one point. Or cats, a lot do that sometimes, and then they come back together. Well, that's people who watch horses run, notice they don't actually run like that. And then the question came, is there ever a point in time when a horse runs that all four hooves are in the air at the same time? But if a horse is running at 30 plus miles an hour, it's kind of hard to see. So, introduce photography. Now, photography is already around in the mid to late 1800s. So from there, it was just a matter of, well, how can we use cameras to pick it up? Because back then cameras weren't like the cameras we have today where you just hit that quick shutter speed and take a bunch of pictures. Well, what they ended up doing was they went to a horse track and they put cameras down the line. So as a horse was running down the track, it would trigger all of these cameras and they would take all of these pictures. So you'd have all of these pictures of all of this horse running along, and the idea was maybe one of them will catch the idea of are all four hooves up in the air or not. So they started pulling all these pictures and started realizing if you put them together and then have them go in front of a light source, you all of a sudden see motion happening. And it was a weird discovery. I mean, it had to start somewhere, right? So this is where we get it. So the whole idea from this comes from, let's stitch these pictures together and move them past you, and you can see the horse running. Now, if you're ever bored as a little kid and you grab yourself a tablet and you're bored and you drew a little stick figure at the bottom, flip the page, draw a stick figure with a little bit of difference, and a little bit of difference, and a little bit of difference, and then just went like this, you can see the little stick figure moving along. It's the basic concept. I mean, you're moving this image along a slightly different image moving along, and at a certain rate of speed, your brain stops seeing individual images and starts perceiving motion pictures. So you see the idea of motion pictures coming into play here. Well, what's that how's that phenomenon work? Well, film, when you're watching a movie, shoots at about 24 frames per second. So in 1 second time, 24 pictures go by. So that sounds pretty fast. Video is 30. Technically it's 29.97, but most people just say 30. So 30 frames per second. So 24 for film, 30 for video. And the idea is if it moves along fast enough, you don't notice. So that's how it works. Now, your brain doesn't need quite that much, but if it's much less than 24, you start to notice, and it starts to look like all kinds of jittery. So to have that fluid motion, 24 is a very good standard to use. 30 works really well for video as well. So that's how we move into the idea of motion pictures. Now, what gets really fun is when they start playing with that frame rate. So most people in America like sports. Well, what do you think slow motion is? Well, slow motion, you think if video, you're watching your television, watching the game, it's 30, so slow motion must be slower than that, right? Like 10, 15? No, it's actually the other way. So if you're watching something in slow motion, it might be shot at 60 frames a second and then played back at 30, which means it would be at half the speed. So now all of a sudden you're looking at something that's slower motion. It's half the speed. So if you want to really slow it down, like when you're watching your football games and they have super slow motion, they might have cameras that are shooting at 1,000 frames a second. So that really slows it down. So if you take 1,000 frames in 1 second and then play that back at 30 frames per second, then they're really just going really slow. And if you want to catch some crazy stuff, like when they're trying to do the pictures of a bullet being fired out of a gun, you've got to have it like very, very fast, up to 100,000 frames per second, then play it at 30. And then you can just slowly see the bullet coming out, and then the smoke, and then the fire as the bullet comes out of the barrel of the gun. So again, that's how they do, your slow motion and your ultra slow motion on your sporting events. Because again, there's no such thing as video. They're not making the video go faster or slower. They're shooting it with an entirely different camera. In the olden days, you would slow it down how fast you would run the film through the camera. But nowadays, you just have better cameras that can shoot at a higher frame rate. And that then when you play it back at a normal frame rate, it gives that perception of going slow. So again, it's not the same thing, moving pictures versus actual video, because we don't have a thing such as it just doesn't exist. We just collect a whole bunch of photos. So if you've ever been to a place where you saw somebody who was taking a bunch of photos and they had their DSLR and they had that thing cranked up to like catching a lot. So they're sitting there, instead of like chick, they have it auto, so it's going brrr, they're catching a bunch of frames. They're not doing 30 per second, obviously, but they might be doing 10 a second or 8 per second, however fast that camera is particularly set up to go. Again, if they stitched all those together, they could make it look like a movie, but they're not aiming to. They're just trying to catch those individual pictures. But that's not far off what Muybridge was doing. Now you fast forward, another fun thing with Muybridge's experiment. If you ever recall watching The Matrix, which is a classic movie at this point, which is kind of weird to think about, but it's a groundbreaking movie in that it's got all kinds of interesting camera work done in it. There's a scene, for example, in the very beginning of the movie where Carrie Ann Moss, the character, the woman who plays Trinity, is being the police are trying to arrest her, and she jumps up and hovers and does a kick, and the camera goes around her and it looks like she's hovering in up in the air. Or the scene on the rooftop when Neo is being shot at by Keanu Reeves' character, and he's like leaning back and the bullets are flying past him and the camera's going around him as he's falling back. That's Muybridge. And if you ever get a chance, you can hop on YouTube and see different behind the scenes for that. But instead of having the camera set along the track, like Muybridge did to capture the horse, they just have the character, and they have cameras all around the character. So they're all running at the same time, and they select when each camera is going to fire or take the frames that they want out of each camera, so you have this smooth motion. So when somebody's up in the air and the camera moves around them. Well, obviously people can't float, and it's not done with wires. In the old days, you'd have to just suspend them on wires, and you'd have to move the camera around them to get them to, to get that feeling. But you'd kind of see them just sitting there and trying to hold the pose. The Matrix, it actually looks like the camera's literally moving around really fast, like they're frozen in time. Well, that's because they used the Muybridge system of having multiple cameras all the way around it, and then triggered them to fire as it went around. It's really neat to think about that kind of stuff, because again, when we think of the idea of movie magic in today's world, it's boring. I mean, they just go in and they use CGI, or they use AI to just fabricate all of it, instead of actually old school thinking. How do we use the equipment that we have, and not like we're cheating the system, but we're using it to its maximum capabilities to help show something that we typically don't get a chance to see. So that's one of those things that's just really interesting to think about, how they push camera technology and the way that we use cameras. So in today's world, it's fix it in post production is the common saying. They just do some basic shooting, and then everything gets done in post production, where they put in all the computer generated stuff instead of actually doing the work, the physical work with the cameras. Now let's back up a little bit further go back into history again. So after Muybridge's experiment comes along, and we start seeing the idea of how to turn a basic camera system into motion pictures, well, the idea of movies then became quite the phenomenon. Now, one of the very first movies ever created was just a basic short film called Train Arriving at a Station, which doesn't sound too exciting because, quite frankly, from our standards, it's not. Someone took a camera and put it at the end of the platform as the train was coming into the station, and they just filmed it. I mean, that sounds horribly boring to us today, but you got to keep in mind the idea of going from a world with no such thing as video to video. Again, we can't really put ourselves into that mode, because we just can't go there. Because, I mean, when was the last time someone had something that just took us from nothing to something? I mean, we just don't see that kind of thing. Even going to CGI, there's always been like animation, and then CGI just takes it to more of a physical thing as opposed to an animated thing, and then they turn that then further into a digital thing, and then AI is just a step beyond that. So we see a gradual change of things. But to go from no such thing as video to video, so keep that in mind. So people who saw this film, they go into a theater, an acting theater, because that's what it would have been. And of course, there's a screen put up and a projector in the back, and then everyone goes in, they turn on the lights, and they start the film. And they're sitting there, and all they see is a train coming at them as the train arrives at the station. Chaos ensues, because all of a sudden, here comes a train. And again, it sounds silly, but in our world, we don't think of it because we see videos all the time. It's just a matter of what are they going to push limits of today. But going from a world where no such thing as video to all of a sudden here comes a train right at you, you can understand why people would jump out of the way. So that's the impact that video has. All of a sudden, it takes the world by storm, and everybody wants to see videos. So the film industry cranks up like crazy, and people start shooting and making all kinds of different videos, and as you can guess, they become super popular. Maybe you've had the opportunity to park your kid in front of the television to watch some cartoons on the TV show Nickelodeon. That channel, the Nickelodeon, is the term for the old movie theater. So for a nickel, you would go see a movie. So you can go see all kinds of movies, and they're just a nickel each. They were called Nickelodeons, which is why the TV channel is called that. So again, the industry, just grew by leaps and bounds. Now, initially, whenever they start doing, cinema work, what they would do is they would just have a theater and people acting as they would in theater, and they just have the camera recording it, just like maybe you would when you take a camcorder or your phone to watch your kid in a play. So it's the basic kind of thing. Just hold up the camera and just sit there and record it. Except back then, of course, the cameras are bigger, bulkier, more complex. So you see that kind of thing. And that's how it was. So it was just a single center shot. That's it. And that was the common way of doing things. So what had happened was in New York, where all this was being driven from, they had very strong rules. And the companies that were forming, got together to make the rules. And they were called the trust. And if you weren't part of the trust, well, you're on the outside looking in. But at the end of the day, you still had to follow the trust rules. So if the trust said everyone has to shoot it from theater stage perspective, that's how you had to do it. Well, a lot of people started thinking, why do I have to do it that way? Well, the trust says so. Well, what if I want to move my camera? And people started realizing that you could. And you didn't have to have just a camera. You could have 2 or 3 or 4. You could have multiple cameras. You could play around with, not being on a stage. You could be outside. You could be in another building altogether. You could be, at the fair. You could be at a ranch. You could be wherever you wanted to go. Well, the trust didn't allow it. So a lot of people packed their bags and headed west, founded Hollywood. So all of these people who wanted to get away from the trust moved out to California and set up shop out in Hollywood. And it turned out to be a big boon for them, because if you've ever been around New York in the fall and winter and spring, it's raining, it's snowing, it's cold, you shut down filming. Hollywood is sunny almost all the time. So you could shoot nearly year round. And they're just far enough away that they're pretty much escaping from the long arm of the law, as the trust would be, so they could get away with a lot of things, because by the time the trust would be ready to start, suing, the industry is already taking off without them. So it's either, look, trust, you either get on board or you're going to be left behind. So the trust eventually had to start breaking free from their own policies, because Hollywood was burying them. But that's why we end up seeing Hollywood as the mainstay, the big thought, the Tinseltown thought of where cinema is. But it didn't start there. It started actually in the New York area. Now, so from there, of course, we start moving into modern history, and we can understand and talk more about cinema at another time in another episode. But that's some of the background stuff that when we understand the idea of moving pictures, how that's how it actually works, and it still is today. So even when you pull out your phone and you start looking at your phone, you can get into the settings and you can see how many frames per second you're recording. And you can also take video and put it into software and start picking out individual frames. So like this video here is being shot at 30 frames per second. So I could get into the software and I can pick out individual frames that I want to have. So maybe I've got one where I'm making a goofy face, and I can take that and make it the thumbnail. Sometimes that's how people end up when they clip videos. They'll find a scene where you're just making the weirdest face, and that's the picture that they use. Thank you, that kind of thing. But that's why they're able to do that. It's not like they're freezing the video in place. They're looking at 30 frames per second, and out of all of those, so this is a 20-minute video, 20 minutes times 30 seconds, that are 30 frames per second. That's a lot of pictures. So you have tons and tons of pictures from which you could choose, and you just say, that's the one I want. So you've like approximately 6,000 pictures that you could pick from, and use that as a thumbnail, or use it, however you wish to use it. So that's the big thing. No such thing as video, even though we call it video, because video, the word for video, where we go vide from the Latin, I see. So video is for sight. So that's the whole idea of video. But when we talk about movies, now you know why they call it motion pictures industries, because it's actually not video, it's actually motion pictures, which is kind of a fun thing to think about, and how things have changed quite a bit from the old days of a train arriving at a station to video footage that's coming in from all around the universe from our little probes that we've sent out over the past 50 years that are sending videos back to us. It's kind of neat to see how far things have changed in such a short period of time. And it'll be fun to see where we go next. But that's what I have for you today. Thanks for tuning in. As always, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. Thanks for tuning in this long anyway. But I'll see you next time on Communicology.